This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. There is no original date given for this interview. Also, no location has been specified for this interview. The interviewee is Mr. Orlando Walkling of the Perry, Oklahoma area. The interviewer on this interview is an unidentified gentleman. This material was copied on April the 21st, 1989, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Hey, Mr. Walkling, will you tell us about the road and things in general so we can pass this piece of history on to future generations? This was a great day, I'm sure, in your life that it needs to be exploited and so other people may see what life was like in Indian Territory during those times.
Now then, if you'll start over, I've got it right this time. I'm sorry.
I don't know whether I was telling you what.
You started about where you was born and your mother and all. Just take your time. We've got plenty of time.
Well, the Historical Association seems to want me to answer some questions and tell them what I can about the early history of Oklahoma, and I'll try and do so. My mother was a Shawnee Indian. My name is Skipple-Casseet, and my grandfather, my mother's father, my mother's mother died, and a year or so later, my grandfather, his name was Wopoponato, married a Second Fox Indian woman. And the Second Foxes called my grandfather Shockaway, and the Shawnees called him Wopoponato. And he was kind and good, resourceful, and a wonderful trapper and hunter. I had raised a breed of ponies that were small but very strong and attractive and easy to manage, and I grew up amongst a bunch of ponies that were pets, would come in the teepee if we allowed them to. And my name was Skipple-Casseet, and that's all the name I knew until I was 16 years old. I got a job with a surveying outfit that were locating the Rock Island Railroad at present. But at that time it was the Choctaw Road, and the Santa Fe Railroad had already been built north and south across the Indian Territory. Well, they started to build what is now the Rock Island, but it was the Choctaw Road then. As Englishmen come over here from England with capital to build that Rock Island Railroad, and they called it the Choctaw. On all of the sides of the freight cars had printed in big letters in white, the Choctaw Railroad Company. Well, the engineer that was locating the line to build that road on gave me a job as axeman. There's lots of timber and brush, and part of the way we had the axemen to cut the brush and the small trees out of the way. And this Mr. Schoff, S-H-O-F-F, what his name was, a civil engineer. Well, he gave me a job as axeman. There were 5 of us axemen. There's 18 in the gang altogether. Well, I went to work and they asked me my name, and I told them. Well, they wanted to know what my dad's name was, and I told them it was Old Walkling, Orlando Walkling, is what my mother had told me. Well, they put my name down that way, and I have signed it Old Walkling ever since that, Orlando Walkling. Well, I got along real well with the surveyors. I cut a notch in a tree down low, and then another notch a couple of feet higher, and split a piece out of the oak tree. And I'd smooth the side off with the axe to write figures on. The rear chainman, the man that carried the back end of the 100-foot chain, would mark on the stake that I had made. We'd set the stake right where the transit man pointed from his transit, and drive the stake in the ground. Well, wherever there was a curve in the railroad, we had to make one of those stakes. They called it a hub. To have the top of the stake several inches wide, so that the point of a flagpole would set on that stake and could be moved to the right or to the left an inch or more. And at the point where the transitman waved his hand that it was okay, we'd drive a tack in the top of that stake. Well, I had never attended school, but I knew that I had 10 fingers, and that twice, to show 10 fingers twice meant 20. And if it was 21, it was to show 10 fingers twice and then 1. Or if it was 22, it was, or if it was 12, it was 10 fingers and 2 more. And I could figure pretty well that way. I understood it pretty good. That 10 times 10 would make 100. And I could show 10 fingers 10 times, or else just 1, and then 10 times would mean 100. Well, I soon learned what the figures meant. What a figure 2 meant 2 fingers, and figure 3 meant 3, and so on, up to 9. And then the next one was 10 fingers. Well, in a month, or probably 2 months, after I had worked, why, the rear chainman shot himself accidentally. Had a gun under the seat, under the cushion of a buckboard seat, loaded, and it went off accidentally. Went through the calf of his leg. Well, he couldn't work anymore. Well, there wasn't any other one with the crew that understood any better than I did the movements of the transitman in order to show the right place to set the stake. Well, he asked me if I could carry the rear end of the chain, and I told him I thought I could. Well, I was rear chainman then for a while. I got better wages was to get $25 a month when I started. And when I got to be rear chainman, I got 35. And it wasn't but 5 months till I was head chainman. We went from where McAllister is where I started. And we went clear to Amarillo, Texas. Well, on that trip, I don't remember seeing but 2 people besides the crew that was working with me. There were 18 of us in the gang. I had a good old-fashioned razor, and on Sundays or any idle days that the weather was good, well, I would shave the whole outfit, and I'd cut some of their hair, and I would help the teamster. We had a buckboard, and a man named Joe Long was the commissary boss. He would go away with the buckboard, be gone for several days, and come back with a load of supplies, of bacon and flour and all kinds of canned goods. We lived pretty well. And at one place we met an old man named what's his name?
You want to rest?
I can't pronounce his name, but him and his wife cooked for this surveying crew, and her name was Westbrook. Well, the old lady was a southern woman from Mississippi, and she got sick, and the flies were awful bad. Well, we built a log cabin, or a log place for him and her to live in. And the flies was bad, and she was sick. And Sunday and the day that I had off, well, I'd fan the flies off of the old lady with a bush. And I would wet a rag in cool water and put on her head. And I tried to help her all I could. And they had a bunch of dogs, hounds, hunting dogs. And they had one especially. They called him Old Hunter. He was a spotted hound of some breed. He was extra good one. He'd find a wildcat or a coon or any kind of an animal's track, well, he would stay with it till he treed it. And they thought the world of that old dog. They thought he was the most prized possession that they had. They wouldn't have more have harmed that old dog than they would have one of their children. Well, when this old lady got better, they told me if I would quit that job and stay with them, that they would give me Old Hunter. Well, I didn't like the dogs personally as well as they did. I would have to build a rail pen around the flour and the bacon and the supplies that they would bring to keep the dogs out of it. And I didn't fancy him so well, but they agreed to give me Old Hunter if I'd just stay and live with them. Well, I didn't. I went on with the surveyors clear to Amarillo, Texas. When I was paid, I hadn't collected any wages. It was all in $5 gold pieces. I had my pocket full of them. Well, I and a fellow named Frank LaRue stayed there at the camp, and the rest of the crew went back to McAllister. Well, the engineer told me and Frank LaRue to take that chain and measure the distance from where they would have to be a bridge built to rock quarries where they could get rock to build the foundation of the bridges. And Frank LaRue and I was more than 2 weeks of getting back to McAllister after the rest of them had. And the people at that time had found out that there was going to be another railroad built through there, east and west, in place of the Santa Fe, which had already been built north and south. And people commenced to flocking there at McAllister and started to build a great many buildings, and there was tents and covered wagons all over. People was busy building houses and getting ready for this Choctaw Railroad Company. Well, the boss told me that in a couple of weeks they would go on east from McAllister. I had been west, and they'd go east on an east division of the railroad, and for me to stay around there, and they'd soon be ready to go east. Well, they had started to build a hotel, a mountain hotel. It was about half done, and there was serving meals, and they fixed a few rooms there for people to sleep. Well, I didn't like that, waiting around McAllister, and I had my pocket full of $5 gold pieces. And the Santa Fe Railroad was already in operation. Well, I went down to Denison, Texas. It was about 90 miles on the railroad. And walking around the streets there in Denison, and I seen them selling horses at auction. Had a real nice looking small horse, a claybank or yellow color, and a new saddle and bridle. Well, I bid on them, and they sold them to me. Well, I rode the horse back to McAllister the next day, and I saw Mr. Schoaf, and he said that it would be a couple of weeks yet before we was ready to go east. Well, I tied the pony to the stockyard fence that night and got a little feed for him. And the next morning I got on him and I rode north. I gave up the job. But a year before I got that job, I was in the edge of Kansas, and I had a horse and a cart, and a man named Wells, close to a little town named Fredonia, was shucking corn, and he gave me a job to help him shuck corn. And he was short on horses, and he could work this horse of mine on the wagon that we shucking corn in. And I worked for him a little while. And I agreed. He had a farm right south of Fredonia, just over a hill, a mound. And I done real good with Mr. Wells, and he told me that they was going to put a cannery in Fredonia, and that they had offered him a lot of seed of corn and peas and beans and tomatoes. And they wanted to divide those seed among farmers around there to raise produce to can in this cannery that was going to be built. The man that was going to build the cannery, his name was Lake, Charlie Lake. And I talked to him, and he said, oh, I could make plenty of money by putting that 5 acres of tomatoes and 5 of peas and 5 of beans and 5 of sweet corn on this man Wells' land. And the cannery would furnish crates to pick the produce in, and I could haul them there to the cannery and make plenty of money. Well, I was foolish enough to take the contract, and Mr. Wells agreed to it. Well, I worked ever so hard, and And I had an older sister that was married and had a baby, had a little boy. And she came there to keep house for me. And Mr. Wells gave me a chicken house, a small building, and I got some rails under it and hitched my horse to it and drug it out there to this place. And my sister's name was Lil, and she came to keep house for me while I put that garden in, and she helped me with her little boy. And the peas and the beans and the corn came up pretty good. They looked pretty nice, but the corn never got more than 2 feet high till it started to tossle out. This Mr. Lake had brought the seed from New York, where he had formerly run a cannery. And it might have done good in New York, but this hot, dry weather, it was no good for Kansas or Oklahoma. The tomatoes were cherry tomatoes, was one white tomatoes, never got any size. But the peas especially done well. Well, I hired about 20 nearly all Negro girls to pick peas and took them out there. The field looked wonderful. And they commenced to picking them in these crates that the cannery furnished. And I had bargained to deliver them to the cannery, I believe, for 30 cents a 100 pound. Well, I collected the pay, and I didn't have enough to pay the Negroes for picking them. And I saw that the tomatoes and the corn was going to be worthless as far as capital was concerned. Well, at that time, I got a letter from this Mr. Booz that I had worked for before, and he told me to come back down there to Oklahoma, and he'd give me a pretty good job. And I just left that field of stuff with another man that had put a crop in for this Mr. Wells. And I had 5 acres well, I didn't have 5 acres, but I had a pretty good patch of popcorn. And I had left that horse there with another tenant on that farm and a pig, a female sow. And while I had been gone, he had raised a crop of popcorn, was especially nice. Well then, when I quit that job and had to wait there for a couple of weeks, is when I went to Denison and got that pony. Well, I rode it clear back there to Fredonia, Kansas. And this sister, Lil, lived in Emporia, Kansas at that time. Her husband had the dropsy of the liver, and he got so he's unable to work. And during that time, President Cleveland issued a proclamation to open the Cherokee Strip for settlement on the 16th of September in 1893. At 12 o'clock on the 16th of September, a strip of land that was 57 miles wide, north and south, and the south edge, or the east end of this strip was the Arkansas River. Well, it didn't run north and south. It ran northeast and southwest. Well, that made the south edge of this strip 226 miles long, and the north side just barely 200. The north side of it was at the south edge of Kansas. It came right up to the south edge of Kansas. And before that, in 1889, he had issued a proclamation to open the land south of that strip for settlement. And the people that did come there had done well. The crops was good, and they had found that it produced wonderful corn and wheat, and there was plenty of fish and wild game, and what few people wanted to go there done fine. Most people thought it was a desert, and they thought the Indians was hostile, and they didn't want to go. But those that did done fine. And so the word got out all over the United States that it was a pretty good country. And if they were there on the 16th of September in 1893, they could get 160 acres of land free. Well, there was thousands of young people all over the United States that wanted to get married. And they thought if they'd go down there, they could get a home and build a farm. And they wanted to get land. Well, there was such a demand for it that people commenced flocking down there along the lines to find out where the most rainfall was, and where the best grazing land, and where the most timber was, and to find out the numbers of the land and everything that they had to know to file on 160 acres. Well, there were so many came that there wasn't a half enough land in that strip to accommodate them. They found out that they had to register along the line at a booth, they called it, and get a certificate that they would have to have when they went to a land office to file on the 160 that they wanted to, that they would have to have one of those booth certificates. Well, there was a booth, they called it, every 24 miles along the north edge of this strip. There was some tents and a rope stretched around them, and 2 or 3 officers in the tents with desks and writing material, and the lines of people that wanted to get to the booth to file would have to stand in line and go in the booth about 10 men at a time. And they would let 10 in, and they would ask you questions and where you were born, and if you had ever taken a claim before, or if you was married, and if you passed the test, why, they would give you a paper that was that you would have to take to the land office when you went to file on a claim. Well, those lines to get to that booth was 3 or 4 miles long to file. You'd have to stay in the booth maybe 5 minutes or 3 minutes, and they would let 10 out and let 10 more in. So you'd stand in line a minute or so, then step up about 10 feet. And those lines was at least 3 miles long on both sides of the booths. Well, I saw at Arkansas City is where I first came to the line. The town of Arkansas City was 4 miles from the line of this strip. And there was so many covered wagons passing a ranch that I had worked on in Kansas for Ed Barker in Coffee County, Kansas. I didn't leave the ranch till about 2 months before the strip was to open. And there's 2 other men that worked on the ranch wanted to go to the strip too. Now, horses, any horse that looked like it could run a long distance was valuable. And every man you would meet, strangers, the first thing he'd ask you are you going to the strip? Said, I'm going. I think that's a good deal and get 160 acres down there free. It's good land. Well, so many wanted to go that there was wagons passing this ranch all headed south every day for months before I quit the ranch, before I quit the job. Now, on some of the wagon sheets, they would have a sign painted just in daubed on with black, say, in Nebraska we busted. No, in Cleveland we trusted, but in Nebraska we busted. But let her rip, we'll make it in the strip. And on other wagons I saw signs that I remember. And on other wagons, I saw signs that I remember would say, taters grow tall in Oklahoma. We'll plant 'em this fall and we'll eat 'em tops and all. Or something like that. They would probably be leading a hound dog behind the wagon and a chicken coop tied on one side and a wash tub on the other. And nearly all would have a rifle or a shotgun tied to the bows of the wagon so you could see it from the road. And every cornfield and haystack within a half a mile of the road for 200 miles was stripped. Corn and haystacks. At night, the wagons would be so close that they'd just have to back up along the fences on both sides of the road as close as they could stick part of the way. And they had to have horse feed, and they had to have food. And wasn't any way to get it but to help themselves. An apple tree that you could see 100 yards from the road that had red apples on that you could see there wouldn't be an apple on the next day. And they just completely destroyed lots of things. Now, at night, they'd want to make a fire, and rail fences along the road was good fuel. Well, one place that I remember, the owner was running back and forth along his fence and hollering, leave this fence alone, it's mine. I need it, leave it alone. Well, a man would have a rail, and he'd say, well, I only took the top rail, and another fellow would have one, and he only took the top rail, and in a few minutes there wouldn't be any. And it was quite a trip. When I got to Arkansas City, then I found out about this registering business. Well, I went on to the line, and all along the south edge of Kansas was fenced. Farmers lived along there. It was pretty nice kind of a country. Water was scarce. It was dry and dusty, hot weather, even in September. So much traffic on the road that horses shod, the dust was a foot deep in places, and people sweating and dust a flying, and you couldn't couldn't keep clean. There was no toilets, no place to get out of sight. And along this strip line was just level prairie as far as you could see. There wasn't any place to get out of sight or anything. Well, standing in that line, some people couldn't stand it. It was so dusty and so hot, and people had money, would try to buy a place in the line. I had stood in the line there for a couple of days, and I got up within a half a day longer, I could have got to the booth. Well, there was an old gentleman came along, and he said that he wasn't able to stand in the line, and he wanted to register, and he'd give me $25 for my place in the line if I'd step out and let him step in. Well, the parties in front of me and behind me in the line were willing, and I stepped out, let the old man step in. Well, then I went back to the tail end and started in again. Well, the second time I sold my place for $10. I was there about 2 months before the opening. Well, then those other two boys that came with me went into, we didn't stop at Arkansas City. We went on 24 miles to the next booth west. That was at Honeywell, Kansas, was the town right along the line. Well, there was a little creek just west of Honeywell, a quarter of a mile or so, that was dry. Well, these other two boys and I got spades, and we dug a ditch as deep as we could throw the dirt out, about 30 feet long, right in the bed of this creek. It was dry. Well, then at one end of this ditch, we dug down a square step, dug down again as deep as we could, and threw the dirt up on the first step, and then had to throw that twice. Well, at the other end of the ditch, we got it down as high as we could throw the dirt out. And then we started the third step down and struck water. It was cool, and you could drink it, although it didn't taste very good. Well, I would get down in the deepest one of these steps and dip up a bucket of water and hand it to Bruce Manley was the other boy's name. I'd hand that bucket to him, and he would hand it up to Charlie Hoover, and he would sell it there to men that was standing around there waiting to get a bucket of water for their horse or a drink. Well, we divided the money, and I made $6 was my share for about 3 days there of watering horses. Some of the horses hadn't had a drink for several days, and the men would drink what the horse would leave in the bottom of the bucket. Well, I had more money the day that the strip was to open than I did when I got there. They was standing in that line, people passing there every once in a while. Some fellow would have a bucket of water that was dusty and pretty near thick with mud and sell you a cupful for a nickel. Well, that was a hard experience to get that booth certificate. But it was altogether useless. When I went to the booth, they had forgotten all about that and didn't even ask you if you had a booth certificate. But I still had mine, and I gave it to the museum just west of Perry, Oklahoma, and they have it on display there yet. Well, I got that certificate, and on the day of the run, I was ready. I think that was the longest morning that I ever passed mentally. I was out there before daylight, my horse's head in the strip and his tail in Kansas. Along that line, the horses was as thick as they could crowd together for 200 miles, as far as I know, waiting till 12 o'clock. Well, I knew that I couldn't get a place in that line unless I was early. Well, I was out there before daylight. Along that line, there was a soldier supposed to be every half a mile, and if you went in the line, across the line into the strip before that minute, they would take your head right away from you. You couldn't file on a claim. If the soldiers caught you a minute before 12 o'clock, and at 12 o'clock they shot a gun, and you could hear from one soldier to the next one, and that was the start of the biggest horse race, I believe, that has ever been through any war or any other time. There was thousands of men there on their horses ready to spur 'em and go at 12 o'clock. Well, I rode in there about 8 miles south, and there was a big sorrel horse with the shafts and harness and wheels of a cart, but the body was off and the lines was flying in the air, and the horse ran along side by side with my horse for several miles. And I come to some level land, and I seen the other fellows standing around holding a stake that they're driving, holding their horse that was ahead of me. Well, when I came to a level place that I thought I'd like to have, I got off and stuck a stake in the ground. And there was other fellows standing that I could see all around there. And we didn't know where the corners of the places was, or where the lines was. And there might be a dozen of you on one place. When you did find out where it was, there might be 8 or 10 on some of the places. And everyone would say he was here first and tell the others to get off. Well, now the quickest men with a gun and the biggest bluffers were the ones that got all of the best land. There might be a dozen of you on one place, and the best shot with his gun or the biggest bully was the ones that would keep it. They'd run the rest of them off. I heard of one old man by the name of Nelson was, well, I don't know how to describe him, but he was heartless and cruel. Besides wanting the land, had killed 6 other fellows on the same land. When they found out where the lines of it was, there were 6 besides him on the same place, and he killed them all. And there were dead men and dead horses all over that strip the next day. Well, when I found out the number of my place, it took me 2 weeks. Another old man and myself took the wheel off of a wagon and measured around it carefully how far it was around the tire of the wheel. Well, now that had been surveyed in townships, 6 miles square, 25 years before the opening. And lots of those stones that they put at the corners of each township had been washed away or broken off or gone. And there were some trees, big trees, that they was close to the corner of a township, that they had blazed the bark off and burned on there with a hot iron the numbers. Well, now, in 25 years, the bark had grown over that, and you couldn't tell the place. And it was a big job to find out the corners of the townships 6 miles square. But those townships were divided in 6 miles square was the first. It started at the northwest corner. The first mile was section 1, and the second mile was section 2, on to 6. Well, there was another bigger stone with 6 marks on each side of it that shows that it was 6 miles each direction to another one.